Then he packed the Pentagon to protect him, replacing the 4 top leaders in the chain of command with his worshippers. Now he and Pence are inciting China to violence over Taiwan. He's inciting his voters to riot over what he calls the Democrats' election fraud, when only the Republicans committed any fraud, and lots of it. Who needs the Russians to destroy the country when the Republicans destroy the world? This is Rahu insanity, and this is what this Ravana configuration is all about. 6 times the usual insanity for him, because he thinks he can get away with these things. It's not just that he's doing them, he actually believes it'll work. That he's going to own the military when, after the names he's called them, they want him out. And all he has to do is just maybe one more thing, like try never to leave the White House, and he's out. And his sanity is just beginning. Starting November 15th, the sun still has to transit over the sign of Vrishchik with 2 Ketus and 2 destructive moons. These 4 are for both Trump and the United States. I say destructive for the moon because Trump's moon owns his 12th house of insanity, loss, prisons, death. Actually, the same qualities as Rahu. And for the United States, its moon rules the 8th house of destruction and death. So because these moons rule these 2 signs, they embody those qualities. None of Trump's deranged schemes will work. Charlie Lutz said we would have martial law. Maharishi said people would go insane in the streets, and all man-made governments would fall, never to rise again. He said there would be mass destruction. For Trump, his Ravana configuration has 2 suns and 2 moons, 2 Rahus and 2 Ketus. These are the planets of eclipses. Darkness, disasters, and so forth. That's what these embody. His birth Rahu and a transiting Rahu, plus his birth Ketu and transiting Ketu, the sun and moon are there for a while, transiting over that, and that's where his sun and moon were when he was born. So that's why there are 2 of each. And they're there for an eclipse of a kind. That's what it's called in Jyotish if they're very close. Some call it combust, burned up by being too close to the sun. The day the sun enters that sign on November 15th. But then, guess what? On December 14th, we have a total solar eclipse with 2 Rahus in the 6th house of conflicts for the United States and 2 Ketus in the 12th house of death. And death and destruction, really, for the United States. And in Trump's 10th house of power in the world, 2 Rahus, and in his 4th house of emotions, the Sun, and his 5th house of Purva Punya, big return of karma. His destructive moon is also there. All of this during this coming total solar eclipse. Jupiter's been protecting the United States for the past year, dwelling in the 1st house of the United States because it owns that house. So it's very comfortable there. But on November 20th, Jupiter leaves the 1st house of the United States and no longer protects it. And worse, where does it go? It goes into Nicha, debilitation, damaged. And that's in Capricorn. And joins a harmful Saturn there. It'll be there a year with Saturn. And sending all that harm that it gains there back to the United States, to the house it rules, harming the United States in general, because that's what the 1st house does. It sums up the whole country. All of this while 2 suns and 2 moons are with 2 Rahus and Ketus in a Ravana position. And that means Rahu is in Aries, Vrishab, and Ketu is in Scorpio, Vrishchik. And during this time, Trump is in a Rahu Dasha. It's called a ghost Rahu Dasha because it's really a Jupiter Dasha for him, but his Jupiter is so weak it behaves like Rahu. So he's essentially in a Rahu Dasha, the demon Dasha. I say 2 suns and 2 moons because it's Trump's birth sun and birth moon opposite each other. And then there's going to be an eclipse there where his eclipse was when he was born. And the sun and moon will be transiting over those 2 Ketus and 2 Rahus during the eclipse, and Trump's destructive moon. It's destructive because it owns his 12th house, which represents loss, prisons, insanity, and death. His moon, therefore, embodies those qualities. And in late October, he entered a ghost Rahu, Saturn, Rahu period. That's the dasha and the sub-period, because you break Rahu down into parts, shorter periods of time. And you take Saturn, which is the bhukti, or antardasha, and you break that down into smaller parts still. And you single out the Rahu Pratyantara, it's called, that 3rd level of division. The Pratyantar is divided, and there you get Rahu Pratyantar. So it's Rahu and Saturn and Rahu working together, it's not a good time for him. Rahu's an 18-year period where Rahu in general began to dominate him, which began just before he was inaugurated. Well, Rahu is 18 years, Jupiter is 16 years, so he's like in a Rahu dasha that lasts 16 years instead of 18. And he just finished his real Rahu dasha before that for 18 years. And when that ended, his Jupiter dasha began, which behaves like Rahu. That's like having two Rahu dashas in a row. What did that do to him? And he's in the middle of this, not in the middle, but in the early stages of this Rahu dasha now. Are you astonished yet? That's a lot of Rahu. That's a lot of Ketu and damaged moons and eclipses and dashas and pratyantars and bhuktis. But now for something really astounding. Guru Chandal Yoga. It's a yoga, it's a union of planets, and they aspect each other, or they're in the same sign together. Some Indian Jyotishis say this is very destructive. And it happens to be the same for both Jupiter and Rahu, 5 and 9. And remember, Trump's Jupiter behaves like Rahu. So it's like Rahu influencing Rahu in his case. One is shining its light into the other, except that they're both dark. And they're just influencing each other. They blot out the light of the sun. So it's like Rahu influencing Rahu in mutual sharing of damage. For his 10th house of power in the world, too. As you know, right now, Trump's chart has his Rahu joining his transiting Rahu in that sign of Rishabh. That's the Ravana configuration. And both these Rahus cast their rays onto his birth Jupiter. And that's down in Virgo for him. And his Jupiter behaves, of course, like Rahu down there. And aspects onto the transiting Jupiter, which behaves like Rahu, which is in his 6th house of enemies and obstacles. And it is Nicha there, debilitated, weakened, ruined, sitting in its worst sign. And vice versa, mutual influence on each other. From that dark place of debilitation, it's casting its rays onto the other Rahu in his 10th house of power in the world. I wonder what could be happening to his power in the world right now. It's because of all of this Rahu business, and the Ravana configuration especially. But it's just layers and layers and layers of Rahu. It's an astounding conglomeration of planets that are doing bad to him. Trump's 2 Rahus damage his Navamsha Rahu and his birth Jupiter, which behaves like Rahu, and vice versa. That's his 4th house of emotions and his 12th house in the Navamsha.